Thank you all. Thanks for coming. Buffy, thank you for your invitation and the open reception that I've had here at Elon. So we'll just get right into it. I am James Padilioni, Jr., and that should say PhD candidate all on one line, but I'm not being too ambitious. One day we will have to drop the candidate, I hope, but not yet. Today's not that day. So my research generally situates the African diaspora as a preeminent field for thinking through the historical relations that have structured and materialized the networks that African peoples have used to mobilize and circulate resources in their varied yet persistent efforts to create meaningful lives out of the fragments of the Middle Passage. I know it's a long sentence, but in particular, my dissertation is titled Black Ecstasies, in parentheses, remembering the diaspora through St. Martin de Porres. And that project chases the broad question of how exactly did Africans create lives of meaning out of the fragments of the Middle Passage by way of following the trail of Martin de Porres or Martin de Porres. I'll probably switch back and forth today. We're in the 17th century, so I'll probably stick with Martin. He is born in the 16th century, died in the 17th century. He was a Peruvian lay friar, canonized by Pope John XXIII as the patron saint of social and racial justice in 1962, making him the first saint of African descent from the Americas. And his longue durée within the diaspora now spans 6 centuries and presents him as a generative archive for interrogating the notion of diaspora, as well as distilling the ways that African peoples choose to remember and elaborate their own history of enslavement and racism through their oral histories and folklore. And so my dissertation presents a model of diasporic practice that arises from several case studies that are based in a mixed media archive, including documentary sources, visual reproductions, statuary and other Catholic kitsch and bric-a-brac and those kinds of things. Film, salsa, music, spoken word albums come into this, as well as ethnographic fieldwork. Out of all these case studies, I discern a logic of diaspora through the material and historical movements of Martin within diasporic communities in South America, the Caribbean, and the United States from the 17th century over the long durée into the 20th. So today I'm going to present one of these case studies, but first I want to talk about, well, I'm cut out some things there, so we'll move ahead here to who is Martin de Porres. There's a big white blank on the screen. I do want you to see this picture. I'll show you briefly, because it's the only picture of him that is actually like historic from the 17th century. So that was the picture that you were going to look at. But since Google Drive hates me today, you're going to look at this blank rectangle instead. So Martin de Porres was born in Lima, Peru in 1579, the son of a Spanish father named Don Juan de Porres, who was a middle-level bureaucrat in the colonial administration, and a formerly enslaved mother from Panama named Ana Velázquez. Martin's father was in and out of his life as a child, but he eventually brought Martin and his sister Juana to live with him in Guayaquil, Ecuador, when he was working for the colony there. Martin returned to Lima when he was 12 years old with his mother, when he was apprenticed to Dr. Marcel Rivera, who was a surgeon barber, who had a clinic in the heavily African barrio of the city called Malambo. And after acquiring the skills of a cirujano barbero, which include barbering, sacamuela, which is teeth pulling, bloodletting, as well as preparing medication, Martin entered a Dominican convent at 16 years old in the role of a donado, which is a lay servant. Because Martin was a mulatto, half white, half black, within colonial casta, he could not enter the priesthood directly and take vows as a priest, so that's why he donated himself. But nevertheless, as a lay servant with the Dominican order, Martin he focused his social ministry in particular upon the enslaved and the indigenous communities, attaining fame as a medicine man, curandero or hierbero, herbalist. And he has legends including instantaneous healing, bilocation being 2 places at once, states of ecstasy and levitations, subtlety, the ability to pass through solid objects, and the ability to talk with animals. So It's that time of the world where the Catholic saints in the 17th century could do anything and everything almost, and Martin has a lot of those tropes that show up in his stories. So two chapters of my dissertation deal with the few 17th century texts that first represented his legend. So the first one is the Proceso de Beatificación, which includes witness testimonies taken between 1660 and 1671. That started 21 years after Martin's death in 1639. And then there's also the 1675 Vida Prodigiosa, Prodigious Life, which was published by his friend and fellow Dominican Bernardo de Medina, which is the first official hagiography, which is a spiritual biography in the Catholic Church of his life. So I want to talk about the frame of how we get Martin's legend in the first place. And the colloquial expression of framing someone is setting them up to look culpable for something which they are innocent for, points to how frames create their reality, or frames have this kind of lurking suspicion that makes, if we frame someone, there will be a kind of lurking suspicion around them, perhaps, about like whatever the issue was that they're being framed. And this comes into play when we make judgments, whether they're intentionally or unintentionally a misidentification. Right? So in a similar fashion, we can say that someone or a group of people framed Martin de Porres. Right? In this case, those 17th century documents that first relate his legends were produced by and through the power and authority of the Catholic Church, and as such they are elite texts that obscure as much as they reveal about the experience of daily life, particularly for the Castas and the enslaved Africans of Lima. And so the testimonies of each witness, after going through an elaborate swearing in before a public notary, must be thought of as a performance, more so than an honest, off-the-cuff recollection of Martin. So microhistory is a methodology that looks to local, discrete archival documents, usually court proceedings, and instead of reading them for a chain of events or a line of causality, say, we're based within the time of the testimony within microhistory. And I'm reading for them in a lateral way. So with someone, a little snippet or a detail of something that comes through the testimony, you can kind of think of the microhistorical method as hitting pause on the timeline and running outside to see if we can verify what these people are saying in their testimonies, or what are the currents of thought and things that are moving in the world that are causing them to say what they're saying, or where they might have derived their knowledges from. So as Carlo Ginzburg, who's a major progenitor of this method, noted, microhistory does not eschew the fragments of an archive, but rather, quote, accepts the limitations while exploring their gnosiological implications and transforms them into a narrative element. And I think developing methodologies for fragmented archives is especially important and needful when dealing with the history of slavery in the diaspora, as the fragmentation and at times outright silence of the archive is not just a coincidence of history, but is the very lingering trace of power. And as a historian of slavery, you have two options, right? You either write through and with the fragments, or you throw your hands up in the air and you write nothing, and writing nothing is not an option. So, in the Catholic frame testimony, I think we're a little off here, but I'll just keep reading. In the Catholic frame testimonies, there are three versions of a story that appear, in which either an African, an Indian, or an Afro-Mestizo, which would be mixed African-Indian, servant of the convent, he might also be a slave in these different stories, named Brother John, also known as Makeka Palapa. But Makeka Palapa witnessed Martin in all of his spectacular, ecstatic glory. So the quote is, Brother John, who was often called Makeka Palapa, and who is now deceased, a very simple man, called the said servant of God a flying witch for having seen Martin levitated in the chapel about 9 feet in the air, by which occasion he came out in a shriek saying, this mulatto is a trickster witch and goes flying with the crucifix. So that's an actual direct quote from the Vatican's testimony in 1671. So here, though, we see how this Catholic text itself raises this question of witchcraft, only to have the text itself, in the way of 3 white Spanish priests, correct the record. And every time this story shows up, they mark Makeka as very simple, right, in the text. So that his misidentification of Martin is able to constellate, I think, with irrationality and simplicity. And there's almost a hint of ironic humor, because as Makeka says, that Martin flies with the crucifix, right? And of course, you know, you can almost imagine this kind of joke, right? Like silly Makeka, right? Everyone knows witches fly with brooms, not crucifixes, right? However, I want to resuscitate the notion of trickster witch, not to prove it true, but rather to see how those terms might have operated within a kind of black vernacular frame in Lima. And even though Makeka is a third-person exclamation, because it's other people remembering what Makeka said in those testimonies, I want us to ponder perhaps how Makeka's declaration is actually the kind of haunting echo of a black frame that cuts in and out of these more Catholic elite-produced narratives. So we can unpackage that more. Yeah, there should have been another slide before this one. But so trickster figures. Well, trickster figures populate West and Central African folklore. They're often personified animals. They use their native wit and subterfuge to overturn power hierarchies or to cross boundaries, revealing the boundary as artificial and unstable. And so there's a lot that I could say here about trickster figures, but I'm going to stick with Henry Louis Gates' notion of signifying that he derived from the trickster corpus, and pointing out this black hermeneutics, or a black vernacular way of interpreting and creating meaning. And it draws upon this tradition in black storytelling. Gates draws upon this tradition in black storytelling to point out how the communication practices of tricksters often take place across several registers. Right? And so this understanding of indeterminacy of meaning gives rise to what's called double voicing or signifying rhetorical games, as ways that Africans across the Americas have encoded their communications with expressions of their values and critiques of institutionalized, racialized power. And so I also want to expand signifying and double voicing beyond linguistics and parole and rhetoric to also locate that kind of double voicing within performance and gestures and embodied gestures as well. There are also potential sites for locating black truth or black ways of understanding, we'll say. But so to bring this a little bit more to the ground, forms of these rhetorical signifying include boasting, bragging, loud talking. So like if someone's across the room and you want them to hear what you're saying, but you don't want to directly say it to them, I have a conversation with this person really loud about that person. Rapping, right? We have this, that's standard. Playing the dozens, or like mama, your mama so fat, jokes back and forth. Throwing shade, issuing a read, right? All these rich rhetorical like games that black people play. Right? So that's the trickster part, I think. Witchcraft, this is kind of messy. This picture is, I want to point out, yeah, it's hard to see in this picture. It's coming from like Flemish and like almost Spanish controlled areas of the Netherlands, but we'll come to this in a second. Just note on the right-hand side, there's a woman that is naked who has another person putting something on her back, ointment. So witchcraft has long had negative connotations as a system of magic in which a witch or a brujo can cast a spell against someone and bind them in some way. And those powers derive from unauthorized liaisons between the brujo and the devil. But much of our understanding of this negative image of witches comes to us from the Inquisition and the holdover of the Inquisition and the Protestant Reformation together as these kind of joint forces in which witches become hunted all across Europe. If we bracket the gendering of witchcraft as feminine, just for today's purposes, although that is important, I think a closer look at witchcraft reveals it as herbalism, or just repertoires of botanical and pharmacopic knowledges and practices, you know, if you think of recipes and cooking almost, that primarily deal with healing and wellness, with the belief that sickness has its origins in all dimensions, bodily, material, spiritual, and social. And within Latin American context, this kind of folk healing is called curanderismo, and the healer is a curandero, a curer. So in Martin's historical life, Iberian Catholicism and the Inquisition had already established a link between plants and witchcraft. And the infamous witch's brew of the 16th and 17th centuries is the trope that represents this. So the physician of Pope Julius III, Andres Laguna, in 1545 gave this account after they had raided a witch's cabin. Among the other things found in the hermitage of the said witches was a jar half filled with a certain green unguent, like that of populeon, which is a poplar ointment from the white poplar tree, with which they were anointing themselves, whose odor was so heavy and offensive that it showed that it was composed of herbs cold. So there's still like the hot and cold humor system here. And soporiferous in the ultimate degree, which are hemlock, nightshade, henbane, mandrake, of which unguent by way of a constable who was my friend I managed to obtain a good canister full. The Pope's physician went on to administer this green ointment to a woman and put her into about a 30-hour coma, or she was passed out or she was tripping or something, right? But they knew that these plants were more than just plants, and that you could mix the alkalines with fat and make these ointments. And some of these witch legends with the broom is that you would apply these ointments to the broomstick, and then these ointments are best absorbed in mucous membranes of the body, so either the armpits or the groin. And so you can see where those images go of women riding broomsticks who are witches, and what's going on there, right? So in Peru, Inquisition witchcraft trials, though somewhat rare, often position Afro-Peruvians as sources of herbal knowledge and technical skills. In 1648, when the Inquisition tribunal knocked on her door, Doña Luisa was chewing coca leaves with another woman. And of course, right, coca is a plant that's coming from the Inca directly. So they're not in Europe anymore, but there's a tradition of hallucinogenic plants being associated with witchcraft. After being brought before the court, Doña Luisa, who was a cuarterona, or 1/4 African, she explained that she first learned about certain herbs and ointments for love magic from una negra, so a black woman. She learned about other plants from indios, from some of the Indians, and she learned about coca and the drink that Indians call chicha, which is a drink made from coca, from another negra, and a sacred altar stone she learned about from a mulatto sacristan. So on her testimony, everyone that she says she's learned how to do what she does from was either Indian or mixed black or black, right? So I think there's enough going on that herbalism is a strong signature of witchcraft in the 17th century, in a way that maybe we don't have quite the same memory of right now. So I'm sorry, that's supposed to be another picture there. So I want to highlight from out of the 17th century text Martin's healing ministry and his herbal knowledges, which is a distinct expression of his concern for black people. And though he was born free, he made his community among the enslaved of Lima, and his daily schedule consisted between taking trips from his convent to some of the several haciendas that are outside of Lima, where he visited the sick Africans and indigenous Andeans along his route. But because his Dominican convent owned the Limatambo hacienda, it is there that Martin planted and maintained a plot of medicinal plants and herbs, which he grew for his healing ministry, including rosemary, chamomile, and an olive grove. These pictures here, it's just hard to see. I don't know if I guess the light's not showing up on the actual screen. But the shelves behind him are like apothecary shelves. But you see him holding his broom because he's a servant of the convent as well, too. And so all these images of him, he's called Fray Escoba, which means brother broom in Spanish, that's his nickname. But you often see pictures of him with, like the other picture was going to have him wearing a medicine bag on his waist with the broom in his hand. And so it's strange that like with brooms and plants being kind of suspicious, that these are the images that are still being circulated. These were both supposed to be 17th century images. So those tropes are there, but nevertheless, they're not being operationalized quite. So Martin's services to the black community were known throughout all of Lima, and the Spanish friars that lived with him often complained about the smell of the sick Africans and indigenous Andeans that he would bring in through the false door, as they refer to it, of the convent, through the back door where he was cleaning usually. And so he had to take them to his sister's house instead. On trial, or on the witness stand, Francisco, who was an enslaved woman of the convent, remembered that after hearing some words exchanged in anger in an alley, a black man was gravely and mortally wounded with a wound in one of his flanks and his intestines hanging out. And when the crowd of witnesses saw this, they took the wounded black to the false door of the convent so that the said venerable brother Fray Martin de Porres would cure him. And Francisca knew, she said that they knew there were always crowds of people coming to the convent because Martin had always exercised great acts of charity with them. And she detailed rosemary and red wine that she remembers him using as he dressed the man's wound. But we get an alternative, I'll show you this too. These are pictures of the olive presses in what's now the Parque de los Olivos in Lima, but this is on the site of the plantation, Lima Tambo. And the right-hand picture on the right-hand side of the paragraph there, this is a tree that they say is the Olivo de la Felicidad, and that it's where lovers go to make sure that their marriage will last. But it says that it sería uno de los olivos que sembró nuestro santo San Martín de Porres. This is one of the olives that was planted by Saint Martin de Porres, our Saint Martin de Porres, more than 375 years ago, as he made his peregrinaje por Limetambo y el Olivar. So his pilgrimages between the olive grove and the plantation and the convent. So that's in Lima today. Okay, this is just a picture of the convent in the inside of his convent. All right, but we have, there's an alternative vision of Martin and his understanding of himself as a healer, though buried in these texts. One morning, the Padre Fray Pedro de Montes d'Oca, who was priest of the convent and had severe gout in his leg, and Martin entered into his room to tend to him, and on account of some childishness, the text says niñería, which is the word, which is like, just like silly kid things or something. So Martin came in a kind of silly mood, and the priest got mad at him and, quote, dishonored him, calling him a mulatto dog and other bad things. And so how did Martin respond? Martin walked out of the room in laughter and didn't come back until the evening of the next day, so that's probably about 30 hours or so. And so this laughter, right, as a black vernacular practice of not directly resisting authority, but kind of dismissing it or disrupting it, and it's vocative, but it's an indeterminate signifier, right? I don't know what the laughter actually refers to. In her work comparing voodoo to other diasporic cosmologies, Karen McCarthy Brown holds that healing is the primary business of African cosmologies, and that healing is not localized only to the body, but entails an understanding that bodily ailments result from disruptions across spiritual and social webs. And so Martin's eagerness to heal the destitute Africans, but his ambivalent laughter in the face of an abusive treatment at the bedside of a Spanish friar seems to indicate that maybe he knew that healing that man was going to be more than just the gout, right? And that the anger that that priest had prevented him from actually truly healing him. So I would argue that Martin's healing does have this kind of diasporic flavor where he's not just there to heal physical ailments, but because when he comes back a day later, he makes sure that the priest is no longer angry and then can, tend to him. And plus, I just get this impression, I just, when I see and read this and I'm trying to put myself in the mindset of Martin, I feel like black folks can laugh in the face of white supremacy and just kind of, you're so lucky that I'm in a good mood today with a nice smile. I'm gonna walk away from you, Mr. White Supremacist, right? But there's an attitude there, I think, that is more than, there's something excessive that isn't captured by the way the Catholic framing of Martin is humble and submissive. Laughing in someone's face isn't a humble thing to do. Okay, Martin steals too. So this is actually the bell, that's me ringing Martin's bell in the bell tower in Lima, Peru. But there are several times in the testimonies where witnesses recall that Martin used to ring the bell of the church every morning and how this was something that he enjoyed doing and that it was like he was excited to wake up every morning and ring the bells. And so on one occasion, Martin knew that he was going to be visiting a plantation that was several days' journey away, and so he arranged for one of his fellow friars to ring the bell. This story comes from Fray Fernando Aragones. Fray Aragones was sick, though, that day, and so he had arranged to have one of the enslaved Africans of the convent to take care of the bell for himself, or have that African take care of the bell, and he was going to pay him a real, which is a gold coin, a Spanish coin. And when the enslaved man went to ring the bell on this morning, he discovered that Martin was already there doing it, because Martin can be in 2 places at once. And so he told Martin, I was going to earn a real for doing this, but now that you've done it yourself, the priest is probably not going to give that to me. And so Martin replies to him, ask for the real anyway, and don't tell him who actually rang the bell. And so, of course, we know this story, right? Because the enslaved African was so excited, he began to tell others at the convent, and the story makes its way into the testimony anyway. But few of them believed him because they knew how far of a distance that Martin was supposed to be. And you can look at this and say that Martin and that enslaved African, like on one level, there's a collusion, right? They're lying and stealing. Right? But on the other, and going back to trickster themes, when trickster stories make it to the plantation, and then just the ethics of tricksterdom on the plantation. Often we have reports from slaves in the United States who say that the difference between stealing and taking from master, right? And that the ethics of stealing isn't, you're not actually stealing from master, you're just taken back because he's already stealing from you every day. And so there's something I think, that kind of element is at work too, that if Martin's going to let the enslaved African take the coin for actually not doing the job, we either say that Martin's letting him steal, and again, that's not a Catholic pious thing to do, or that there's something else going on, right? That this is not true stealing. Yeah, Martin's actually saying, that's yours anyway, right? Whether you actually ring the bell or not, they owe you 1,000 reals, right? So, in tracing this kind of folkloric tradition, these like whispering black voices that make it into the 17th century text, the second chapter that deals with those texts brings it all the way through into Ricardo Palma's Tradiciones Peruanas, which are published between like 1880 and 1900 or so. And Palma is the son of a single mother. She was Afro-Mestizo, so he's raised by a mother who's African-Indian mixed and grows up in a very poor neighborhood. And so he becomes a lettered, literary man, but has this root and this history within Black Indian Lima. And he writes these traditions, his stories, traditions, he says, based on what Las Viejas in the street would say, right? So the old women in the street, whatever he's hearing, he's just writing down their folklore. He also says in another place that, no invento, yo copio, right? I don't invent, I copy. Right? So he himself says that all the stories he writes are just folklore that he's heard. Palma's tradition of Martin continues to show, I think, how folk tellings and black folk tellings of Martin center his kind of trickster witch dimensions as a racialized critique of white Catholic power. And so Palma produces 2 accounts of Martin that go as follows. As we've already heard, Martin's superiors were not happy with him bringing too many sick people into the convent. And so by the 19th century, this element of the story had morphed into Martin being banned entirely from performing any miracles. And as such, Martin was walking down the street one day and saw a day laborer falling off of a roof. And this is in the tradition. Martin freezes the man in midair, but then remembers that he has this prohibition against doing what Palma called milagrando, which he made this word up, performing miracles, or miracling. Right? Martin runs to the convent to ask the prior if he could finish saving the man's life that he had suspended in midair. In another story, the prior of the convent asked Martin to go buy him some sugar, but didn't give Martin enough money to buy white refined sugar, and so instead Martin returns with brown sugar, azúcar muscovado, and without allowing the prior then looks at the brown sugar and says, "Don't you have eyes, brother? Can't you see that this looks more like shit than sugar?" But there is no nice way to translate what was in that. So, this is what he says to Martin. So without arguing, Martin says, "No se incomode su paternidad." Don't worry, father. And takes the sugar and washes it in like a wash bin and turns it white. But of course, right, you see both of these cases, Martin is almost a magician in these stories. And his supernatural abilities are used to play tricks on the superior as a racialized critique, right? Because who's truly superior? The man who is invested with church authority, or the man who's invested with the power to levitate and suspend people in midair, or who can transubstantiate or transmute, right, brown sugar into white sugar. So those folkloric tales show, I think, that there was this thriving trickster witch understanding of Martin within Afro-Lima that continues all the way through the colonial period and into almost the turn of the 20th century. So in closing, I've tried to sketch out the kind of shadow side of Martin, attuning to the lower frequencies in the folkloric storytelling frames employed by Afro-Peruvians. And thinking of this idea of frames and the black frame cutting across a white frame, if you think of within the diaspora, cut patterns and break patterns like kente cloth are the way that, again, it's the way of producing meaning, right? And so the pattern can be broken and start in a completely different spot and then break and start in a completely different spot again. And why that might seem a little chaotic within a Euro-American kind of framing of things, within an African worldview, the cut pattern and the break pattern is exactly how things become meaningful. And so these little cuts in the story of Martin, these traces and these lingering whispers of a black frame that cut across the white frame, I think, point to the vernacular performance of Black Lima as a multisensorial modality and communication, a multisensorial modality of communication and a field of mobilization for diasporic projects. And by focusing on Martin as a historical figure and a figure of repetition within Black cultures, I think that we can distill from him the diasporic projects that are radical enactments of intimacy, sociality, and affiliation amongst Black people, responding to chronic conditions of loss and displacement, and that form a counter-narrative of history in the African Americas. Thank you.
Great.
We open it up for questions, comments. You said you were having writer's block. So
Yeah.
You want to help him?
I'm gonna grab a sandwich while it starts. And,
Well, I'll start by saying that was great. So
Thank you.
I'm in, for those of you who came in a little bit late, my name's Kristen Landry Montes, and I'm a new art history professor here. But so I work with mostly Native American, particularly Maya work and Aztec work, but also African to a degree, and we're actually curating a show on the body in African art, and we're putting it up today. So we have a series of Kuba cloths that have a lot of these like breaks and patterns, and so we've been trying to work through meaning and how that creates this sense of cohesion. So I just wanted to say that this was amazing, and I wish I could have wrangled on my students here, but they're all in class. But I also thought that since you're in the PhD process as I am, this really reminded me of what happens during the colonial period, like at Tenochtitlan, but also in the Andean region. And Barbara Mundi is a colonialist in that area. She works specifically with the Aztec region, but there's a really great map, the Nuremberg map of Tenochtitlan, which maybe you've seen, where I'm happy to talk with you more about it. But so it's a map that was sent back, commissioned by Cortez to be sent back to the King of Spain with some of his letters. And so it's a woodblock print and looks very European, like all the Tenochtitlan looks like a European city. But what has happened in very subtle ways is that we think now that a native Nawa-speaking person or indigenous person had actually tried to, I guess, break this European frame and insert elements into the map that only like an Aztec person would have been, only those things would have been important to an Aztec person. But it's kind of like hidden or at least disrupting somehow in this very kind of trickster way.
Right.
The overarching, controlling European narrative that was, trying to really control the conversation at that point, obviously. So there's like the placement of the sun between these two seemingly medieval temples, which is
I think I have seen this actually.
Yeah. So it's a really cool way that really reminded me of what you were trying to talk through, especially with the representations of Martin with the broom, right, and like in front of the apothecary.
And it's like there's a wink and a nod or something in those pictures. It's just like,
yeah.
It's like, does anyone else not see right, that this man is standing in front of all these plant ointments and holding a broom?
Yeah. So that's like less of a question, but maybe more of a commentary that I'd be excited to talk to you more
Okay,
about.
thank you.
Oh, that's a question. Well, more of a comment. I was actually smiling when you started discussing the concept of the trickster, and to see how much sort of this Black way of thinking and being extends all the way to the Caribbean. And the narrative that we have, particularly in the island of Jamaica, is Anansi the spider. This idea of this trickster, and how I grew up hearing my grandmother, when she wanted to teach me a lesson, right, she would give me an Anansi story, and within that story is what I should be doing.
What's the takeaway?
Well, the takeaway of the
Right.
story. And so I'm thinking, if you're looking to expand that section, it'd be good to look at the other Caribbean islands and the ways in which that trickster persona is sort of unpacked. And many of us grew up knowing, okay, don't tell me an Anansi story. So it's now used for, please be quiet, right? This idea that there's a story within the story.
Right.
And how that, even on the island of, all the way from Peru in Jamaica, it's still that same sort of concept
Right, right.
of this trickster. And of course, Anansi's a spider that's not really a spider, and he's small, he's kind of like a man looking like a spider, and it's in lots of children's book. And so that's carried down through Jamaican oral tradition as well.
That's great. Yeah, I've never read any of the Anansi stories directly, but it's come up and stuff off the side, so I need to.
Yeah, Anansi's quite a trickster.
And if you get the chance, because you're taking a folkloric lens, to think about what Cheryl's describing, you describe as sort of parent or grandparent and child.
Yeah.
I think we often think about some of those folk tales, but they're often shared by adults too.
Yeah.
And so if you shift that frame and think about, it sounds like the stories you're talking about, that's adult to adult. I mean, there are themes there that are being played. This isn't, I'm not trying to teach you something, right? This isn't an educational thing to a child. This is real play, which is, I mean, you're using the signifying monkey from Henry Louis Gates seems spot on in terms of this very adult verbal play that's happening.
Right. Yeah, especially in those, the Palma's legends seem very, like you would have to already be critical in the same way to get the, like where the criticism comes into the humor. You know, the humor is critical, but not to everyone. You know, only to certain people who are critical of the church in that way, or critical of race hierarchy. So that's why I think, especially the brown sugar one, there are people who've done work that there's very little Afro-Peruvian folklore that is from the 19th century. Like there's been revival movements in the early 20th century of like folklorist revival, but I don't see white Peruvians getting the same kick out of the brown sugar magic trick in the same way that people of color would. I mean, like that seems like a story that people of color are the ones telling themselves as like, you know, we know who's really in charge.
And I apologize for coming in late on thesis defense, but so you may have already said this. Are there parallel narratives told within the white colonial powers? And the reason I ask is people seem to be quite aware that this is a guy who has extreme power, and yet he's the janitor, right? I mean, they're not treating him in a way that sort of recognizes that power, but his African-American, or not African-American, Afro-Caribbean peers do. Do we have those other stories that suggest how in the world white people are reconciling this obvious power? Do they see him as a witch? I mean, are they tapping into that too? Do they? I mean, they're giving him some robes.
Right. So then this is, I think, so I don't know what point you came in, because the being called a trickster witch shows up in the 1671 testimony. I don't know if you were here.
I was here for that.
Okay. And so
But that testimony was from whom? It was from.
So it's white priests who are remembering the deceased, either African or Indian servant, who said this, and so like it seems very deliberate that like they're going to remember what this other person said, so that way they could raise that suspicion, I think, directly themselves first to the Vatican, and then kind of immediately correct it in the record that, but clearly we as the authority, the priests, when we come into this situation and hear Makeka screaming, they're able to tell, no, this is the power of Christ. And so when they repeat that story on testimony, it's like, I think it's just a demonstration that like and they also mark him as simple, And so it's like they want to have on record that the simple non-Spaniard person in the room thinks it's witchcraft. But all of us clearly know that like witches fly with brooms, not crucifix, right? And it's just like the wording of that, right? That this mulatto goes flying with the crucifix. I mean, it just seems so like the anvil is kind of hovering in like a kind of trope way, you know, like, did he really say that he goes flying with the crucifix in the same, like, he could go flying with his broom too, right? So I don't know about that story, even if it's, you know, like, well, I don't know what's true at some point, because once you get past these documents are being produced by the elite of Lima, so that way because they want to have him canonized as a saint. And they started this in 1660, so they're, you know, this is in the heart of the colonial period. They want to have this mulatto, humble. He's a fruit of the colonial project, right? He is the son of the new castas, you know, that are emerging, and he represents the, you know, the ability and the power of Christ to convert even Africans, right? So like, it's very important for the elite of Lima that he is a saint, and I think that's why they put that witchcraft charge in their very curated document, because there's a whole, everyone who has to be sworn in, there's a whole, like everyone gets repeated what they have to say before they get sworn in. There's a number of things that are just excluded outright. If you've ever touched a relic of his, or if you've ever come into contact with a relic, or not a relic, excuse me, a produced item that was not an actual relic. So they've cut out a lot of testimonies of people who don't have access to his actual relics, because all the Lima elite are the ones who were like there at his sepulcher, cutting his robes and stuff. So they have all the real relics, and their relics are admissible as miracle producing. But anyone who just has like a bulto, which is like a little image, or if you had like just a painting or something of Martin at the time, and you said that that was somehow miraculous for you, those testimonies are not even included in this record. So I'm just trying to think through like who has the if there is a big Afro-Peruvian devotion to him, but they are all producing their own images or their own medallions and medallas and things. None of their testimony.
It's not like the stories you're talking about. That's adult to adult. I mean, there are themes there that are being played. This isn't, I'm not trying to teach you something, right? This isn't an educational thing to a child. This is real play, which is, I mean, you're using the signifying monkey from Henry Louis Gates seems spot on in terms of this very adult verbal play that's happening.
Right. Yeah, especially in the Palma's legends seem very, like you would have to already be critical in the same way to get like where the criticism comes into the humor. You know, the humor is critical, but not to everyone. You know, only to certain people who are critical of the church in that way, or critical of race hierarchy. So that's why I think, especially the brown sugar one, there are people who've done work that there's very little Afro-Peruvian folklore that is from the 19th century. Like there's been revival movements in the early 20th century of like folklorist revival. But I don't see white Peruvians getting the same kick out of the brown sugar magic trick in the same way that people of color would. I mean, like that seems like a story that people of color are the ones telling themselves as like, you know, we know who's really in charge.
And I apologize for coming in late on thesis defense, but so you may have already said this. Are there parallel narratives told within the white colonial powers? And the reason I ask is people seem to be quite aware that this is a guy who has extreme power, and yet he's the janitor, right? I mean, they're not treating him in a way that sort of recognizes that power, but his African-American, or not African-American, Afro-Caribbean peers do. Do we have those other stories that suggest how in the world white people are reconciling this obvious power? Do they see him as a witch? I mean, are they tapping into that too? Do they? I mean, they're giving him some robes.
Right. So this is, I think, I don't know what point you came in, because the being called a trickster witch shows up in the 1671 testimony. I don't know if you were here.
I was here for that.
Okay. And so
But that testimony was from whom? It was from.
So it's white priests who are remembering the deceased, either African or Indian servant, who said this. And so like it seems very deliberate that like they're going to remember what this other person said so that way they could raise that suspicion, I think, directly themselves first to the Vatican and then kind of immediately correct it in the record that, well, but clearly we as the authority, the priests, when we come into this situation and hear Makeka screaming, they're able to, tell, no, this is the power of Christ. And so when they repeat that story on testimony, it's like, I think it's just a demonstration that like and they also mark him as simple. And so it's like they want to have on record that the simple non-Spaniard person in the room thinks it's witchcraft. But all of us clearly know that like witches fly with brooms, not crucifix, right? And it's just like the wording of that, right? That this mulatto goes flying with the crucifix. I mean, it just seems so like the anvil is kind of hovering in like a kind of trope way, like, did he really say that he goes flying with the crucifix in the same, like, he could go flying with his broom too, right? So I don't know about that story, even if it's, like, well, I don't know what's true at some point, because once you get past these documents are being produced by the elite of Lima, so that way because they want to have him canonized as a saint. And they started this in 1660, so they're, this is in the heart of the colonial period. They want to have this mulatto, humble. He's a fruit of the colonial project, right? He is the son of the new castas, that are emerging, and he represents the ability and the power of Christ to convert even Africans, right? So like it's very important for the elite of Lima that he is a saint, and I think that's why they put that witchcraft charge in their very curated document, because there's everyone who has to be sworn in, there's everyone gets repeated what they have to say before they get sworn in. There's a number of things that are just excluded outright. If you've ever touched a relic of his, or if you've ever come into contact with a relic, or not a relic, excuse me, a produced item that was not an actual relic. So they've cut out a lot of testimonies of people who don't have access to his actual relics, because all the Lima elite are the ones who were like there at his sepulcher, cutting his robes and stuff. So they have all the real relics, and their relics are admissible as miracle producing. But anyone who just has like a bulto, which is like a little image, or if you had like just a painting or something of Martin at the time, and you said that was somehow miraculous for you, those testimonies are not even included in this record. So I'm just trying to think through like who has the if there is a big Afro-Peruvian devotion to him, but they are all producing their own images or their own medallions and medallas and things. None of their testimony is admissible even. And so like this is a very curated, parsed and pared down set of testimonies, and then you still have this same story 3 or 4 times show up where we keep repeating this man's a witch. Like, why would you want the Vatican to have that in their head? Unless you do want them to have it in their head so they get their own doubts settled at the same time. Right? There's a woman who, Celia Cusson wrote a biography of Martin that came out in 2015. She's a historian in Argentina, historian of slavery. So her and I have emailed about this story a few times actually, because I'm just like, what do you think is happening here? Why would they want that in the record? And like this, we both kind of have the same opinion that it just seems like it's intertextual to raise the suspicion within your own text, so that way it doesn't come from the outside, or maybe like when I was a teenager, if you can tell your parents you did something wrong first, you can maybe leave some things out, but you get to be the first one to tell the story, versus letting them find out the whole thing on their own outside or something. Whoever gets to set the tone first can kind of run the narrative, I think. But I don't know, like, again, this is all speculative, and I don't think there's any way, there isn't going to be some other record of like the Congregation of Rights that's like our notes and why we want certain witnesses. Like, so it's lost to history, I guess. Either we speculate or we don't have anything.
Well, he brought up something that I was going to piggyback on her and then went to, but the question of supremacy. And I saw the same thing as far as the position of servants actually having a lot of access to the superiors as far as medically, domestically, you know, their secrets, their health, their children, their homes, and actually having the knowledge, abilities, and skills to manage these things for the superiors. And so that question of who's superior, who's not, but that it comes down to superiority versus authority. And so if you have an authority, they don't have to be superior because they are in charge of everything. And authority is gotten by means of maybe armory, you know, force of whatever they're able to establish authority with, but it does not make them necessarily superior. And I think that these stories that run through you know, African history on Trickster is basically to, like you said, tell you, so to remind you of your superiority as an African, that even though it may seem that you are not by the authority, but the access that you have and the knowledge that you obtain through your access actually does make you superior in some way. So it keeps you in your mind knowing that you are, regardless of the authority. And then as authority, you can make a superior person be evil, and therefore a witch, even though, because you have the authority to call their superiority evilness or witchery or what have you. So that's just my 2 cents.
No, it reminds me of, I think Toni Morrison has a interview somewhere, maybe it was Charlie Rose, where she talks about she always knew, her father always knew that he was morally superior to white people. And it was because of the moral, like not that we're like in a white supremacist way, but that the morality of not being as bad as they were to black people in the town that she grew up in, right, gave them the moral high ground.
He didn't have to. Like his laughter going out of the room, to me, is the mindset of, you'll need me before I get here. I'll be back. It's what I feel. Because I'm not letting you sit, you are. So I'll see you when I get back. Who's the one to be there, right? I'm glad you brought Toni Morrison, because I have a CD that I play for my grandson in the car by Toni Morrison. She actually narrates, and it goes, "Who Got Game?" And she has these little stories, and it basically says that who's actually superior. And this, you know, one story is about a lion and a mouse, and other stories about.
Again, if you don't know how black folks put the world together, then you see these things and they don't stand out to you as anything remarkable. And every one of these figures can get written about as just humble, meek servants, and it's like, no.
Well, it's they're creating a counter space within a space, so they're not moving their counter space is kind of themselves. Right, and through these tricks, because you mentioned the idea of the counter space. He in and of himself is a counter space.
Right, and he is.
He embodies the actual counter space, and so there are people or ways, I think, when you are in situations, like if you think about slavery and the fact that you have, you know, in most situations you have no escape, right? You're in it. How do you create this counter space within that all-encompassing oppression, right? And he has figured out a way to do that, or I think it's the roadmap of how to do that has been in these cultures for eons, in terms of these tricks, these plays on words, these code switch that are so subliminal, the idea that you have a greater, not notion, but game kind of in play. As I'm thinking of, you know, when I went to graduate school, my mother told me I need to read one book. She'd never been to graduate school, but she said you need to read The Spook That Sat by the Door. And like, if people know this book and the idea of this man who is recruited into the CIA and kind of plays the trickster, plays down his abilities to gain information, to gain access so that he can then take this and lead his own revolution. And so she said, if you're gonna survive,
This is what you need. Yeah.
you need to be the spook that sits by the door. And so sometimes when my students leave, I say, if you want one book, read the spook that sat by the door. And so the fact that, you know, he's not only sitting by the door, he's with the broom, right?
Right.
He's
at the fall store, right?
Right.
You know, which that to
Yeah.
me is another fun, like that they all the Africans refer to it as the false door.
Yeah.
It's just like it's either
Yeah.
a door or it's not, right? Like, so there's
Yeah.
like it's a false door, like it's a door for them, but not for
Yeah.
anyone else.
No one else really.
Or it's a door that they
Door.
don't, it's a door that exists that no one else sees, right? So it's not a false door for them,
Right,
it's a
it's-
door that exists that nobody else is seeing. So he's kind of the spook that's sitting by the real door, or the door that everyone is agreement that is there. And when people are not looking, he's
Right.
creating this other door, which is exactly what the Negro spiritual does, which is exactly what the
Right.
code switch does, which is exactly what the counter space does. It creates another door.
And I would just highlight, you know, I think we can talk a lot about sort of Martine as sort of the creator of a lot of this. But this is a folk narrative tradition.
Yeah.
So you've got a community of men and women who are sharing those stories, who are actually the ones perhaps really structuring that story and that narrative and identifying perhaps, I mean, so, you know, Martine could be navigating that space very subtly, et cetera, but you've got a community who recognize it, pick up on it, and then continue to narrate it in very public spaces or in very official spaces. So I would, you know, as much as you can, think about the person, but also this narrative tradition that speaks to a much larger group.
The other thing I didn't mention in the presentation, but one of the things that Martin would do at that plantation is teach the Bosales, which are the Africans who had been unhispanicized, who were brand new in. And so he was the one that was supposed to be teaching them in the Catholic faith. And so like that whole project has always been one of like making connections with what people already know to try to point them towards like Christian theology. But like, again, now, you know, it's like, what is he actually teaching them when he's teaching them, you know, is he teaching them how to code switch your way through Catholicism? Or is he actually 100% orthodox in his lessons? Like, I mean, there are things, other details that say like he was always consoling the enslaved, and he recognized their burdens as enslaved people. So it almost seems like it would be irresponsible for him to not at least give them one lesson on like how to deal with racism, right?
Well,
Like,
especially if he's allowing them to keep the coin, even though they did.
right, you know, like so he's part of their community, right?
Right.
You know.
So I wonder what his legend, his presence would be had the church not said, let's canonize him, right? Because in some ways, that canonization is basically the gentrification of.
And it kind of pulls him out of the vernacular folk saint into he's real saint now.
And so do you wonder if him telling the man not to tell anyone about the coin, that he actually knew that the man would tell, and he meant for it to be told?
He wanted that story, right? Because
as his position, he can always say, you know, believe me, or this,
Right.
I'm this, and
And that story
and
again
just
is
go
another-
tell it on the map
It's
type of
just,
thing.
it's funny, like all this, like, and no one seemed, in the testimonies at least, no one ever talks about that as like, was that an ethical thing to
Right,
do?
exactly.
Right? You know, it's just like, they just love the story, right? Because it's another story that puts Martin in this mystical, you know, mode, which is what they need in the 1660s and 70s to really sell, like in 1600s, every Catholic saint can levitate or talk to animals or something. So like you have to have those stories. But it's like, these are stories though
Right.
that are almost working against the church at the same time they're working
Just
for.
yeah.
Right? And
There's
yet,
such an arrogance or a disbelief that someone could be that level of trickster, right?
and it's like, it might just be too that so many of the, like some of the key witnesses to some of the most miraculous things are Africans. And so like, when those are the people who you have to let them tell the miraculous stories, but then they interpret it through their own hermeneutics, right? And like it comes out with this low key but shadow, like there's this other side of the story that like sometimes you can discern that if you know how to. But I think that that's part of what's working here is that you do have so many Africans who were witnesses to Martin every day, and so they have the stories. whereas the Spaniards have the relics, but they don't have Martin as like living with them or hanging out with them or like working at the plantation with them. And so the anecdotes come from the African community, and then white Spaniards reporting things that happen to Africans who are not on the stand themselves.
So does it matter if it's believed, who it's believed by? Does it matter if it's believed by the Spaniards or as long as it's believed within the African community?
Right.
He probably didn't care whether.
What happens on the other side is
Exactly.
It's interesting though, because the power narrative, right, becomes one of appropriation in the end, doesn't it? That it's become a folk saint to, oh, now, well, yeah, you can't canonize him.
right.
And from the provocative post-tenure email quote, this famous quote, at first I was like, oh my gosh, this is, and then you start talking, I was like, oh, maybe this is a good quote. But no, this is not a good quote. But it's just,
So, see, that was
Coffee said something.
I never in my life thought I would see that. Fast staff that said, it's Mulatto.
when I came across that, it was just like,
It's like,
this
James
is
did
gold.
this.
Yeah, it's just like, this man said, like, this is in the record. Like, it's so visceral and so vivid of a description. Like, yeah.
It's like, I don't know what that is, but I must be there.
As a mulatto, I can get away with using that word, right?
I was thinking, in your dissertation, as you're thinking about implication, what this means for the lives of Black folks today, or those of us in different contexts, I was thinking about possibly the work of Patricia Hill Collins on the inside or within, this idea about particularly Black faculty within the academy and our role as the inside or within or the outside or within. And I also thought about Frantz Fanon's work, Black Skin, is it Black Skin, White Mask, or the other way around? And he's also a mulatto, if you're going to use that term, Frantz Fanon, and he was writing about his experience and this idea of going in and out, right, in one space, in this particular space, then taking what you know to that space, and then going back and forth. I think those two works might help you as you think about, so what does this mean for us who are sitting around this table and interacting and engaging in dialogue with African descended people?
and I didn't know, I like
Thanks for pouring here.
No, sure. But I like what Matt said about stories about appropriation, and I didn't know the whole timeline of Martin's journey towards sainthood, and I imagined a lot of significance to the different eras of it. There's this real African moment of the 17th century, but then there's and I don't remember. It's 1837 is ish. Peru independence, right? I mean,
That's when he's canonized.
and that's right, and that's
when that's when he's beatified.
That's right, yeah.
and it's one of these coincidences or not, you decide, and then it has its own purpose. And then 1962, we all sort of know that cultural moment, and that's when he's canonized. So each moment, Martin is serving a different community and a different purpose and a different story, and that occurred to me as an interesting element too.
And that was the timeline that I was trying to get a handle on with the
That's right.
white
One is the
narrative.
white-
Yeah,
I wanted that too.
I got an answer
But
for you.
it
I got a
seems
better
like-
answer. Because so when in 1839, the Dominican order authorized a new hagiography to come out 2 years after beatification out. Written by another like mixed race doctor, I can't think of his name right now off the top of my head, Juan Vasquez, I think. But he in the beginning he's talking about like I was born in the same lowly state as Martin, as we're both Costas and whatnot, and like we're both medicine men, although like he's an actual trained surgeon at the University of San Marcos and all this now. And so, but in that 1839 hagiography, he goes through all the miracles and says that only 2 of them are veritable and the rest of them are dubitable, and that, right, because it's like Enlightenment, modern science, the new Peruvian Republic. And so he strips down all of the like ecstatic resonances that were from the 17th century text and just makes Martin this symbol of piety and and Christian behavior, but like, you know, that the church itself is saying all the miracles that we said 100 some years ago, or 150 years ago were miracles. Now we're taking that all back, saying only 2 of them are probably miracles based on science that we know now today. So yeah, you see this divergence where the church is getting more rational with his story and more, and he's becoming more of just a representation of Christian ethics, where those folk stories that Palma is telling that are supposedly from the same time period, but just the folk on the street, right? They're taking the like magic and just putting that front and center, where like the sugar thing has nothing to do with Christianity at all, right? Like that's just a magic trick. He's not trying to heal anyone there. He's not trying, so you see this wide diversion, I think, that, yeah, who's telling the story? Some people want to keep the witchery, the magic, the trickster stories in the center. Other people want to make Martin just a bland, empty, vessel for their own projection. I think that's the answer you wanted.
Well, and it certainly unpacks it for what we continue to do with them, because
What we continue to do with them is part of that.
yeah, so I grew up Catholic, and my church was called Martin de Porres. That's how we called it, Martin de Porres. We didn't have Martine. But we didn't get any. I'm interested in how he is now constructed as a saint, and not just by the church, but of course, that's what I'm going to find from folklore. So I want to go back to Peru, right? How are these stories continuing to be told and narrated in a new historical context?
Okay, so you did miss. Okay, you missed out at the beginning.
Oh, sorry.
So.
Yeah, you probably wrap up. It's my fault.
So
So I wanna say-
Yes, I apologize.
Thank you all for coming.
Wow.
Please think about coming back next year. We'll have another lineup hopefully of wonderful things. This is a great way to
Thank you so much.
to end the year. This was really
And
fantastic.
this was like brisk. I appreciate all this exchange. That was great. I have a lot to think about.
Good. Well, this is just a little token of appreciation. All your many books, you can put these in a
Thank you.
nice little tote bag, and there's a nice little quote on there that hopefully will give you a little inspiration
All right.
as well. But thank you so
Thank you
much
so
for
much.
coming, and
Thank
thank you.